When all hope was lost for one soldier, this three-day ordeal forged a hero. This is not a story of grand offensives or famous battles, but of a single man trapped in a silent, frozen hell who refused to surrender. In the brutal winter of 1944, on the desolate, snow-swept plains of the Eastern Front, a lone German rifleman was cut off, abandoned, and left for dead. For 72 agonizing hours, he would battle not just the encroaching Soviet forces hunting him, but the merciless elements, devastating wounds, and the creeping specter of despair. With frostbite gnawing at his limbs, thirst clawing at his throat, and the enemy closing in from all sides, he would be forced to make choices that defied all military logic and tested the very limits of human endurance. What began as a catastrophic retreat would become an epic saga of survival, a testament to the unbreakable will that can emerge when every conceivable option has vanished. This is the harrowing account of Gefreiter Lance Corporal Hans Becker, a soldier of the German Ninth Army, and his solitary struggle in the icy wasteland east of Warsaw. To understand the sheer desperation of Hans Becker's situation, we must first comprehend the catastrophic strategic collapse that created it. By mid-January 1945, the Soviet Red Army had unleashed its titanic Vistula-Oder offensive. The goal was nothing less than the utter destruction of German Army Group A and a final, decisive thrust into the heart of the Reich. Among the units facing this tsunami of Soviet steel was the Ninth Army, battered and depleted after years of grueling warfare. Gefreiter Hans Becker was a 22-year-old soldier in the 73rd Infantry Division, a formation now existing more on paper than in reality. Hailing from a small village in Bavaria, Becker was a quiet, competent soldier, not a fanatic, but a man who believed in doing his duty for the comrades beside him. He carried the standard-issue Karabiner 98K rifle. His uniform was patched and threadbare, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare common to veterans of the Eastern Front. The 73rd was positioned in a series of hastily dug trenches and strong points along the east bank of the Vistula River, near the town of Magdashow. Their orders were to hold at all costs, a futile command against the overwhelming force gathering in the frozen forests opposite them. On January 14, 1945, the world exploded. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces, from heavy howitzers to Katyusha rocket launchers, opened fire in a bombardment of apocalyptic intensity. The earth shook for hours. German forward positions were simply erased. Then came the infantry, supported by endless waves of T-34 to 85 tanks. The 73rd Division's lines crumbled within the first day. What followed was not a fighting withdrawal, but a bloody, chaotic rout. Units disintegrated. Command and control vanished. Men fled westward through the deep snow, pursued by Soviet mobile spearheads and harassed by ground attack aircraft. Becker's company, reduced to a ragged group of 30 men, was ordered to form a rearguard at a shattered village crossroads to buy a few precious hours for others to escape. They dug in among the ruins, knowing it was likely a suicide mission. The temperature hovered at minus 20 degrees Celsius. The wind howled across the open plains, whipping snow into stinging clouds that reduced visibility to mere meters. As they prepared their final stand, Becker checked his rifle, his fingers stiff and clumsy in his worn gloves. He shared a last cigarette with his friend, Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer. They spoke not of home, but of the practical, ammunition counts, fields of fire, the location of their single MG-42 machine gun. Little did they know that in a matter of hours, this position would become a tomb for most, and for one man, the starting point of an unimaginable trial. The Soviet assault hit at dawn on January 16th. It was not a subtle probe, but a direct, violent push by a company-strength force of Siberian troops, hardened to the cold and supported by two T-34s. The German MG-42 chattered, its distinctive ripping sound cutting through the wind. One Soviet infantryman fell, then another. Becker, positioned behind the rubble of a brick wall, fired methodically, his breath pluming in the icy air. The first T-34 fired its main gun, obliterating a farmhouse where their platoon leader had set up his command post. Brick dust and snow mixed in a gray cloud. The German Panzerfaust team rose to engage, but a burst of machine gun fire from the second tank cut them down before they could fire. The situation was rapidly becoming hopeless. By 0900 hours, Soviet infantry had flanked their left side, moving through a sunken orchard. Close quarters fighting erupted among the ruins. Becker heard the sharp cracks of MP-40 submachine guns and the deeper reports of Soviet PPSH-41s. He saw Fisher fall, hit in the shoulder, dragging himself behind a cart. Then, the decisive blow. A Soviet mortar round, expertly aimed, landed directly on the MG-42 nest. The gun fell silent, its crew dead. With their central firepower gone, the German position collapsed. An officer, his arm bleeding, screamed the order to fall back. It was every man for himself. Becker scrambled from his cover, grabbing Fisher by his good arm. "Come on, Klaus. Move." They stumbled through the back gardens of the shattered village, bullets snapping past them, kicking up puffs of snow. They reached a frozen creek bed, a shallow trench of relative safety, and joined a handful of other survivors running westward. For 2 kilometers, they ran, lungs burning in the frozen air, the sounds of battle fading behind them. Their goal was the main German fallback line rumored to be forming near a wooded area. Hope, thin and fragile, began to flicker. It was then that fate intervened with cruel precision. As the group of 7 survivors crossed an open field, a hidden Soviet sniper opened fire from a copse of trees 300 yards away. The first shot dropped the man in front of Becker. The second hit Klaus Fischer square in the back. Fischer gasped, a look of profound surprise on his face, and crumpled into the snow. Becker ducked, his heart hammering. "Klaus!" He crawled to his friend's side. The wound was fatal. Bright red blood spread rapidly across the white snow, steaming in the cold. Fischer's eyes were glazing over. He tried to speak, but only a faint rattle emerged. Then he was gone. The other survivors, without a second glance, continued their frantic dash, disappearing into a distant tree line. Becker was alone, kneeling beside his dead friend in the middle of an exposed field, a sniper's bullet undoubtedly already destined for him. He made a split-second decision. Instead of following the others, he rolled to his right, down a slight incline, and into a drainage ditch half filled with frozen slush and dead reeds. He pressed himself into the mud and ice, making himself as small as possible. For an hour, he did not move. He heard the crunch of boots on snow, the guttural sounds of Russian voices passing nearby. They were mopping up. He waited until the silence was absolute, broken only by the mournful wind. When he finally raised his head, the landscape was empty but for the corpses in the field. His unit was gone, either dead, captured, or fled. He was miles behind what he thought were the new Soviet front lines. To the west lay open fields and the probable path of the Soviet advance. To the east was certain captivity. His only advantage was a small, dense thicket of pine and birch about a kilometer to the north, bordering a frozen river. It was his only chance. Crawling, then in a low, agonizing crouch, he began moving toward the woods. He had his rifle, 80 rounds of ammunition, 2 stick grenades, a canteen, now frozen solid, a small pocket knife, and a single Artdak biscuit in his pocket. He also had a searing pain in his left leg. Looking down, he saw a dark stain on his trousers. A bullet or piece of shrapnel had grazed his calf during the retreat. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding, and in this cold, any wound was a potential death sentence. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it tightly, the fabric stiffening almost immediately with frozen blood. His 3-day ordeal had begun. By nightfall, he had reached the relative sanctuary of the woods. The temperature plummeted further. Using his helmet, he scooped out a hollow beneath the dense branches of a large pine tree, packing the snow around him for insulation. He ate half of the rock-hard biscuit, sucking on clean snow to quench his thirst. Sleep was impossible. The cold was a living entity, seeping through his greatcoat, his uniform, into his very bones. He shivered uncontrollably. Every sound, the crack of a frozen branch, the hoot of an owl, sent jolts of adrenaline through him. He was a city boy from Munich before the war. This primal struggle against nature was as foreign to him as the enemy now hunting him. Dawn on January 17th brought no relief, only a gray, oppressive light filtering through the snow-laden branches. His leg was stiff and throbbing. He knew he couldn't stay. He had to keep moving to find a way back to German lines, or at least find better shelter. He oriented himself using the weak winter sun and began moving west-southwest, parallel to what he believed was the front. The second day became a blur of pain and cold. He moved from tree to tree, stopping every few minutes to listen. The woods were not empty. In the distance, he heard the rumble of vehicles, the occasional burst of machine gun fire. Once, he froze as a Soviet patrol on skis glided silently past, less than 50 meters away. He pressed himself into a snowdrift, holding his breath until his lungs screamed, the white of his snow-camouflaged smock blending with the landscape. They passed without seeing him. His thirst became overwhelming. Sucking snow only lowered his core body temperature. He remembered a trick an old veteran had mentioned: melting snow in your hands against your body. He spent precious energy doing so, catching a few drops of icy water in his canteen cup. His hunger was a sharp, constant ache. He saw rabbit tracks, but had no way to catch one. His world shrunk to the next tree, the next 100 meters, the next breath. Despair began its insidious work. What was the point? He was one man, wounded, starving, in the middle of a vast enemy-controlled territory. He could simply lie down in the snow, let the cold take him, and the pain would end. The thought was seductive. But then he thought of Fisher dying in the field, of his mother's face, of the sheer, stubborn defiance that had kept him alive through years of war. He pushed on. As twilight approached on the 17th, he found his salvation: a Zemlyanka, a partially dug-out, abandoned earth hut, likely used by a Soviet forward, observer, or a previous German outpost. It was crude, with a low roof of logs and sod, half buried in the snow. It stank of damp earth and old tobacco, but it was shelter from the wind. Inside, he found a treasure beyond price: a discarded, rusty tin containing a few chunks of hardened black bread and a small cache of damp, mildewed German medical supplies, including a roll of gauze and a crumbling packet of sulfa powder. It was as if the previous occupant had left a final gift for whoever came next. He devoured the bread, rewrapped his wound with the clean gauze after applying the sulfa powder, and for the first time in 48 hours, slept a fitful, shivering sleep. January 18th, the third day. Becker awoke to a new sound: the creaking groan of tank tracks and the deep diesel thrum of engines. Peering cautiously from the entrance of the Zemlyanka, he saw a sight that chilled him deeper than any frost. A Soviet column was moving along a forest track barely 200 yards from his hideout. It wasn't just infantry. It was a full mechanized advance. T-34 tanks, Su-76 self-propelled guns, and trucks laden with troops in white winter camouflage were pushing west. This was no local patrol. This was the main Soviet thrust. Any hope of slipping through a gap in the lines evaporated. He was now deep in the wake of a massive advancing army. His escape route to the west was completely severed by the Steel River. The crisis was total. He was trapped. His food was gone again. His energy reserves were nearly depleted. The cold had burrowed into his hands and feet. He could no longer feel his toes in his boots. Frostbite was setting in. The wound on his leg, while not infected thanks to the sulfa, was a constant, fiery ache that sapped his strength with every movement. He spent the morning in a state of numb horror, watching the endless column rumble past. His mind raced through options, each more futile than the last. He could surrender. He could walk out with his hands up. But the stories of what happened to German prisoners in the immediate combat zone, especially to isolated soldiers caught behind the lines, were terrifying. It was a gamble with his life. He could try to go further north or south, but his physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. He was weak, lightheaded from hunger, and his body trembled constantly from the cold. The will to move, to fight, was draining away, replaced by a crushing lethargy. This was the moment when all hope was truly lost. The logical part of his brain screamed that it was over. He had done everything possible. He had survived 2 days against impossible odds. To continue was madness. He slumped against the dirt wall of the hut, his rifle across his lap. He would wait until dark, then perhaps just walk out into the snow and end it. The temptation to surrender to the void was overpowering. But as he sat there, a strange clarity descended upon him. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A childhood memory of getting lost in the Alps while hiking with his father. He was 9 years old, cold and scared. His father had found him, not by panicking, but by sitting down, thinking, and reading the landscape. "When you are lost, Hans," his father had said, "stop running. Look, listen. The land will tell you what to do if you are quiet enough to hear it." Becker was now a soldier, not a boy, but the lesson resonated. He stopped thinking like a cornered animal and forced himself to think like a survivor. He analyzed his situation with cold, detached logic. The Soviet column was moving west. Their attention, their logistics, their command focus was all pointed westward toward the next objective. Their rear areas, the ground they had just passed over, would be chaotic, disorganized, and focused on forward momentum. The greatest danger was here at the immediate front, but behind the front, there might be opportunity. What if he didn't go west? What if he went east, deeper into enemy territory? It was counterintuitive, insane even. But the immediate area behind a rapidly advancing army is often a confusing no man's land, full of scattered detachments, supply dumps, and wounded, all in flux. It was the last place they would look for a lone German fugitive. His goal shifted. It was no longer to reach German lines. That was now impossible. His new goal was simply to survive long enough for the front to stabilize, to hide in the enemy's shadow until he could find a way to slip through later, or until the war somehow ended. It was a plan born of utter desperation, but it was a plan. It gave him a direction, a purpose to counter the despair. He would move east at night and find a new place to hide. He would become a ghost in the Soviet rear. This decision, this defiant pivot in the face of absolute hopelessness, was the first forging of the hero he would become. He was no longer just a lost soldier. He was a determined survivor. As dusk fell on January 18th, the Soviet column finally passed. The forest fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the wind. Becker emerged from the Zemlyanka, a specter in a filthy, white smock. He moved not with strength, but with a grim, robotic determination. He turned his back on the west and began moving east-southeast, using the stars when they peeked through the clouds. He avoided paths and roads, moving through the thickest brush. His progress was painfully slow. His injured leg dragged. The frostbite in his feet sent shooting pains up his legs with every step. After a few hours, he stumbled upon a scene of recent battle, a knocked-out German WWII assault gun and a burned-out Soviet truck. The area was littered with debris, and there, in the moonlight, he saw his chance. A dead Soviet soldier, a junior lieutenant, lay half buried in a snowdrift. With a revulsion he pushed deep down, Becker searched the body. He studied the Soviet map under the moonlight. It was marked with unit boundaries and objectives, all pointing west, but it gave him a better understanding of the local geography. Villages, rivers, forests. He now had a rough idea of where he was. Fortified by this small victory, he pressed on. His new plan was to find a remote farmstead or barn far from main roads where he could hole up for several days. Just before dawn on January 19th, he found it, an isolated, burned-out Kutor, small farm. The main house was a shell, but a low stone root cellar, its entrance partially hidden by collapsed timbers, was intact. He squeezed inside. It was dark, earth-floored, and smelled of potatoes and damp, but it was concealed and defensible. He collapsed in a corner, using his new Soviet greatcoat, taken from the lieutenant, as a blanket. He slept the deep, death-like sleep of total exhaustion. For the next 2 days, Becker remained in the cellar. He lived on a cache of frozen potatoes and turnips he found in a corner, gnawing on them raw. He melted snow in a dented tin can over a tiny, carefully shielded fire made from twigs, venting the minuscule smoke through a crack. He tended his wound. He rested. The vodka was used sparingly as antiseptic and a rare morale booster. He became a creature of routine and caution, his senses hyper-alert. He heard vehicles, dogs, voices, but they never came close. He was a phantom in a cellar, waiting out the storm of war. On the third day in the cellar, January 21st, his vigil was interrupted. He heard the voices of 2 Soviet soldiers approaching, likely foraging or searching the abandoned farm. They were joking, their voices growing louder. Becker's heart seized. He gripped his Kar 98K, his finger on the trigger. He was cornered. He could fight and die here in the dark, where he could be discovered. As the footsteps crunched in the snow right outside the cellar entrance, he made another fateful choice. He did not raise his rifle. Instead, he burrowed deeper into the shadows beneath the old sackcloth, covering himself with dirt and debris, and lay perfectly still, holding his breath. The wooden door to the cellar was shoved partly open. A beam of gray light cut through the darkness. A soldier peered in, grunted something in Russian about it being empty and full of rubble, and let the door fall shut. The footsteps receded. Becker lay there for another hour, trembling not from cold, but from the sheer, nerve-shredding proximity of discovery. He had survived not by fighting, but by disappearing, by becoming part of the earth itself. This was the final, crucial lesson of his ordeal. Heroism was not always about attack. Sometimes it was the profound, silent courage of endurance, of refusing to be found, of waiting. After a week in the cellar, Becker's strength had marginally improved. The front had moved far to the west. The sounds of war were distant thunder. Using the Soviet map and a newfound patient cunning, he began a long, cautious journey not west, but south in a wide arc. He moved only at night, navigated by the stars, and foraged from abandoned fields and farms. He avoided all contact. He was no longer a German soldier trying to reach his lines. He was a survivor trying to outlast the war. His incredible journey lasted for another 3 weeks through the Polish winter. He eventually encountered not a German unit, but a ragged column of civilian refugees fleeing the fighting. Mingling with them, a silent, bearded figure in a mix of German and Soviet clothing, he finally made it to an area controlled by the crumbling Reich. In early March 1945, near the Oder River, he was picked up by a Feldgendarmerie patrol who initially thought he was a deserter or a spy. His story, told in a hoarse, exhausted whisper, was met with disbelief. However, upon investigation, his account was verified. The remnants of his company confirmed he was missing, presumed dead, after the rearguard action on January 16th. The specific details he provided of the Soviet column, the terrain, and the abandoned positions matched intelligence reports. Gefreiter Hans Becker was not court-martialed. He was hospitalized. He suffered from severe malnutrition, advanced frostbite that would cost him 2 toes on his left foot, and a deep psychological trauma. But he was alive. He was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, for his exemplary fortitude, individual initiative, and unwavering will to survive and continue the fight against overwhelming odds behind enemy lines. The citation highlighted his strategic shift in invasion tactics and his successful intelligence gathering. After a long convalescence, he survived the final collapse of the Reich and was released from an American POW camp in 1946. Hans Becker returned to a quiet life in Bavaria, rarely speaking of his 3-week ordeal, much less the pivotal 3 days that forged his survival. He became a forester, a man most at home in the woods he had once feared. His story, buried in military archives, is a masterclass in human resilience. It demonstrates that the greatest heroes are not always those who win glorious victories, but sometimes those who, when all hope is logically extinguished, find a single, defiant ember within themselves and nurture it against the howling wind. He survived through a combination of basic soldiering skills, immense luck, and that critical, transformative moment in the Zemlyanka when he chose thought over panic and cunning over despair. His legacy is the timeless lesson that the human spirit, when tested in the most extreme crucible, can produce not just survivors, but men forged into something harder, sharper, and more enduring than steel. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.